It's Liz Thompson from Sew with Liz, and I'm back with the next step of my quilt for my grandson. What you're looking at now is the back of the quilt, which is a minky fabric, and I deliberately chose that because I wanted the quilt to be really soft and cuddly. And I have done a blog post on my blog called Sew and Learn with Liz Thompson, and I have gone through all the details from start to finish of how I embroidered the blocks on the quilt. I don't know if you can see them, but there's plenty pictures on my blog. I embroidered 15 blocks. I put them together with a sashing of a cloud fabric, and then did two borders, a gray one and a blue one. My binding is going to be gray, and I have already shown videos on how I joined my binding strips and how I prepared them for this stage, which is attaching the binding to the machine. Now, if you put your binding on the front of your quilt and then flip it to the back, a lot of people do that and then they hand sew their binding to the quilt. I don't do that. To me, that's much too time consuming, and I'd rather be doing another project at my machine. So what I do is I sew my binding onto the back of the quilt and then flip it to the front. And I will also show that in another short video, how you sew that down on the front. So it's just 2 rows of stitching. And I'm not going to do the whole quilt, around the whole quilt now. I just want to show you how I start off and how I do turn a corner. This is very much beginner information. So if you've been quilting for years and years and years, this probably will not be new to you. What I like to do at the very beginning, I've got a little bit of a tail here, not a very long tail, but a little bit of a tail. In fact, let's make it a slightly longer tail, just so that we've got more to work with and we're not fiddling when it comes to joining the 2 tails of binding at the end. Now, the quilt has ended up being reasonably big, even though it's for a twin bed, but I wanted it to have a good, healthy overhang all the way around 3 sides of the bed. And so it's all spread out on my table. Try to make sure that you don't have the quilt dragging on what you're doing at the machine, because that's going to cause stitching problems for you. I am using my built-in walking foot. It's called the AccuFeed Flex Foot, and it's the narrow one. The initials on it are VD. I'm actually sewing on the Janome 15,000 because that is the machine that I have purchased. And I like this foot because it has, and I'm going to get my seam ripper and show you, this thing over here, and I'm hoping you can see it, is the upper feed dogs that work at the top. Now, you'll see that I've got 2 layers of quilt here and 2 layers of fabric. So I want those to feed evenly. Some people call a walking foot an even feed foot. We call it a AccuFeed Flex foot, but basically I just call it a walking foot on steroids. All right, now what I've done is I have adjusted my needle position to 5.5, which is a little right of the center needle position, because I wanted a smaller seam here so that when I flip the gray fabric, the folded edge of my binding to the right side, I'll have a slightly larger binding showing on the front. And I also have adjusted my stitch length to 5.0, and that is basically your gathering stitch. And I did that because I want to check if it's going to turn over the sort of length that I want. And it might be that I have to take that stitching out if it's not going to work for me. So that's why I put it on a stitch length of 5. So I'm going to just go a short distance and stop and cut my thread. And now I'm going to come here, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to see it and that the quilt doesn't fall off the table. I'm going to fold over that fabric to the right side. Let's do it like this. And that is going to suit my purposes just perfectly. I wanted a nice healthy binding showing on this side. Obviously on the back, the binding is a little narrower, but that is exactly what I wanted. So now, before I start sewing for real, what I need to do is put my presser foot down, but I need to change my stitch length back to 2.0 because I don't want my stitches to be awfully long like a gathering stitch. I want them to be kind of normal. All right, let me just pick this quilt up a little bit on the table because it was sliding off a little. And now we are set to go. So if you prefer to use your foot control on the floor, go ahead and do that. I am using my stop-start button. And I am what I'm doing at this point in time is, let me just use my seam ripper once again to show you, is I am riding the right side edge of my foot along the edge of my quilt where I've got all those raw edges. So that will be the quilt, which is my minky and the front of my quilt, and the 2 layers of my binding that I have folded and pressed at the iron. So that's how I'm assessing where my stitching is going to be positioned. And every so often when I need to adjust the quilt a little and make sure that it's not dragging on things, because it is reasonably large and heavy, I will just stop the machine and then continue. We know that the stitches are where I want them to be because I did a test run on that gathering stitch, and so we know that my stitches, the position of my stitching is what I want. All right, so I'm going to actually make it go a little faster because you don't want to watch me doing a straight stitch with binding all day long. And so I just want to get to a corner and show you how I do a beautiful mitered fold at the corner. Okay, let's just move the quilt a little more. It really is quite bulky. Uh-oh, there are some little dog ears that I missed when I was pressing my binding at the machine. So let's just get those little dog ears out the way and back to stitching along the edge of my quilt. This is giving you a double fold French binding. That I think is the correct name for this binding, if you want correct terms. Now, I'm going to slow down as I'm coming towards the corner because I want to point something out to you. Here is the end of my fabric. Pretty much that's where it is. All right, I've drawn a little line on the edge of the quilt. And if you want to have your mitered corner to be really, really perfect, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the width of your seam allowance that you've created. I ask this question many, many times, and the answer I always get is, where do you stop your stitching to then turn the quilt and do your folded miter? And everybody tells me 1/4 inch. Not necessarily so. So I'm going to get a little ruler and check what our seam allowance is. So I can bring the quilt round here and check. And if I put this here, in this particular instance, yes, it is 1/4 inch. But if I had done my stitching a little bit further to the right here, it would not have been 1/4 inch. It would have been more than 1/4 inch. And so whatever distance your seam allowance is that you're sewing your binding on with, that is the distance that you stop before the corner. So if we look here, that is more or less, if I just make a little mark in the fabric with my seam ripper, that is where I am going to stop sewing. So that's why I've got the speed quite slow, because I don't want to overshoot that. And I'm coming up to that little mark, and there it is. All right, so now I stop and I raise my presser foot, and this I did not know for the longest time until I saw somebody do it, and I thought, oh, that is so clever. So what I do is I have not cut my threads. I have not raised my needle. I have my needle on needle up down because as I'm sewing and repositioning my quilt, I don't want to lose my position. So I always sew this binding with needle up down. If you don't have that needle up down feature on your machine, all is not lost. What you then simply do is every time you stop sewing, go to the flywheel on the side of your machine, the right side of your machine, and simply turn it towards you so that the needle goes down into the fabric. And then I'm jolly sure your next machine will have a up-down, needle up-down feature. So once again, I'm going to start my sewing, and I am going to sew off the exact corner of the quilt. I've stopped 1/4 inch from the edge, and now I'm going to sew at a 45-degree angle right into the very corner of my quilt. And you're just going to eyeball this because you can't actually see the corner of the quilt, but trust me, it works. Right, so now what I can do is I can cut my threads. All right, I have an automatic thread cutter. You may need to just pull your scissors over and do that with your scissors. All right, so now you can see that I have actually stitched off the corner of my quilt. Now, when I fold that binding up, it automatically goes into that stitching, or folds up against that stitching, and gives me a perfect 1/4 inch miter. And then, of course, we flip the binding down again, ready to go on the second side. And once again, I'm going to start stitching, and I'm just going to reposition my quilt. Needle is down so I don't lose my position. And now I can put the speed of my stitching up again. All right, so there is how to turn a corner on a rectangular or a square quilt or table topper or wall hanging, anything that you might be making that does not have curves. And I'm not going to sit here and video myself doing the entire quilt. I probably could do this binding, I don't know, maybe in about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on the size of the quilt. So I don't want you to have to sit and watch me do all that. So what I'll do is I will sew all the binding on, and then I will return to show you how you stitch it on the other side of the quilt. Okay, that will be the next little video, and I will make sure that I put all these videos with part 1, part 2, so that you can watch them in the correct order. So once again, this is Liz from Sew with Liz, and if you like what you're seeing, you can hit the bell below the video, and you can also look at the links below the video to all the other places where I've got lots and lots of sewing information for you. See you again soon.